Again, welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We understand that summer is such a busy time for all of us, whether it's field work or it's personal commitments. So we truly appreciate all of you taking the time today to join us. Welcome to the IARPIC Data Management Team quarterly meeting. Apologies if I sound a bit off. I'm still recovering from a cold that I caught from my travels last week. But nonetheless, we are really excited for all of you to join us on our discussion this afternoon or morning, wherever you are, on interoperability. So my name is Cindy Garcia. I'm a program manager with the Arctic Research Program. This is within NOAA's Global Ocean Monitoring and Observing. I'm joining this call from the ancestral home of the Anacostan and Piscataway peoples here in Maryland and Washington, D.C. I'm helping co-lead the data team with Vanessa Raymond, as well as Lauren Decker, who's in the call today. And I will let Lauren briefly introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Decker. I am going to be talking a little bit more at the end just to help wrap things up, but that's it.
Thanks, Lauren. All right. So, and for those of you who are new to IARPIC or need a quick refresher on who IARPIC is. So IARPIC is Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee. It brings together leaders from 18 agencies, departments, and offices across the U.S. federal government, as well as other institutions to enhance collaboration on research in the Arctic. IARPIC collaborations, on the other hand, is the public branch of IARPIC. It aims to facilitate interagency communication, coordination, and collaboration to advance Arctic science. IARPIC is currently working on its Arctic Research Plan 2022 to 2026. And we just released our first biennial implementation plan in 2022. And we are currently evaluating and revisiting the next biennial implementation plan. Now, on the data management team, I mentioned the Arctic Research Plan earlier and an implementation plan. So these plans have objectives and deliverables across different themes. And the data management foundational area team, our objective is to explore and encourage FAIR, which stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, as well as CARE, stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, data management principles in Arctic research. So that's the key objective. And there are different deliverables that support the objective. And the deliverables from the previous implementation plan draws from two sustained lines of efforts. And this culminate in summaries of Arctic data management considerations. And the two lines of efforts are to convene new and existing IARPIC partners and members to develop community of interest focused on FAIR and CARE, as well as convene semi-structured meetings and quarterly meetings like this to share perspectives from individuals and groups on implementing FAIR and data principles. The aim of the outreach is to gain new insights while building a networked community of interest. For the new updates, there are new deliverables that were included, and these deliverables for the new version highlight some of the specific funded and initiatives and projects on Arctic data management and infrastructure development for FAIR compliance, as well as some projects on developing data-driven products and tools, and more on those once the final version is released. But I know that's a lot of information, but that's our spiel on who IARPIC is, as well as the data team. Now, for the goal for today's meeting, I mentioned interoperability. We're hoping to discuss and explore strategies to enhance Arctic data interoperability among research teams and across different research domains. So we welcome everyone from different domains. I see people introducing themselves and their work in the chat. And hopefully we can bring together data experts and data producers to share insights and best practices or promising practices on polar data interoperability. And then Lauren mentioned a crowdsourcing document later. So this is one unique thing about data management meetings. We have crowdsourcing documents. It's not just our speakers and the leads speaking during the meeting. It's all of us because it's a community-driven thing, right? So we and I think someone will share the link to our crowdsourced document in the chat. But Lauren will lead the discussion later on this, and the goal is for us to gather your thoughts, your experiences, your ideas about interoperability, our topic for today. But that's enough said. I know I've said a lot on the topic, but yeah, again, warm welcome to everyone if it's your first time on the data management team meeting. And right now, I'll pass it to Hazel to introduce our speakers. Thanks.
Thanks, Cindy. I will actually just go ahead and pass it directly to Chantelle. And if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself at the start of your presentation, that would be great.
Yes, happy to introduce myself, and hopefully as this loads up, you guys can see it all, but if not, please feel free to scream and let me know. But hi, everybody, this is actually my first IRPIC meeting as well. So I see that we're in good hands, good company with each other, a lot of us here. But my name is Chantelle Verhey. I am a newly elected Arctic Data Committee co-chair alongside Vanessa Raymond. And predominantly, I work for the WDS International Technology Office as a research associate, specializing in the polar semantics and data interoperability work package. One of my other hats that I thought I'd mention too is I am actually going into my second year PhD, specializing in CIS, data interoperability and data systems and knowledge and action frameworks. So happy to talk about that after everything if there's interest in that as well. Before I continue on, I did want to do a quick land acknowledgement. So as the WDS ITO office is based at the University of Victoria in Canada, we acknowledge and respect the Lekwinen peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwinen and Wesnak peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So as representatives of the data repository community, we recognize the importance of revising our practices with data to meet the care principles. And fair as well too, as they go hand in hand. So first, a little kind of touch point on what is the Arctic Data Committee. So the overarching purpose of the ADC is to promote and facilitate international collaboration towards the goal of free, ethical, and sustainable timely Arctic data through useful, usable, interoperable systems. As I mentioned, Vanessa and I are just newly elected. We are taking over from the previous co-chairs, Peter Paul Furstein, Tronstad, Martin Tacoma, who held the position for about 10 years. So big shoes to fill, but we are looking forward to, helping the Arctic Data Committee continue after the hiatus of the IASC and whatnot during the war from Russia and Ukraine. So since 2019, regular hackathons have been arranged through the Polar to Global Interoperability and Data Sharing Hackathon. So the link is there, and I'm happy to pop it in the chat after the presentation as well. These hackathons are used to liaise between working groups related to the Arctic Data Committee and the wider polar data community. And a little shameless plug, next P2G would be Thursday, September 18th, for any of you interested. The Arctic Council and subsidiary bodies have been on pause since February 22, like I mentioned, the war, but we recently have been able to start up again. So the Arctic Data Committee has actually been able to put a couple of things on our agendas relating to what our members are interested in and are hoping to make some progress in the coming months as things pick back up. So despite the pause, ADC has not been idle completely. We've been really working to support the different initiatives throughout the community. So things such as mapping the polar data ecosystem, and about, I think it's about 2 slides, I will show a snippet of that as well. Also supporting the polar data search through the Polar Working Group, POWIG, which Shannon will present on next. Also the Shared Arctic Variables initiatives and other working groups. One of our main priorities moving forward is really to focus on Indigenous data sovereignty. So there's a couple of resources here that, again, I'm happy to drop in the chat after my presentation, that we're really hoping to continue to support and bring to the forefront moving forward. This includes revising the IASC data statement principles that have been previously published, as they were published, I believe, in 2014. So this is even before fair and care principles. So we're, as the ADC, going to be helping update that policy, and also be working coinciding with the Arctic Council as they create a data policy for the Arctic Council ministerials moving forward. So kind of, why, how do you orient yourself? Where is the positionality in this? So there's a lot of numerous international working groups. The Arctic and Antarctic community is quite the complicated landscape. As you can see on your left, the mapping the polar data ecosystem. This is an initiative that started back in 2014 to try and understand, which repositories or data centers out there are hosting Arctic or Antarctic data, who's harvesting from who, kind of how does interoperability play into all of this. And it's a lot more complicated than we first thought. I believe after talking with Peter Pulse for a bit, he said that when they were first approaching this, they were thinking it was about 20 data centers globally. And I believe we're about up to 180. So trying to understand these relationships is quite complicated. But even if you're looking at the diagram to the right, again, both messy. How does one person, sit within this landscape and interact with the various working groups? Also, the institutions and funding agencies and own interest needs and whatnot. So through that, there is, I believe there's about 10 working groups or teams here that I wanted to quickly highlight that are all focused on some form of fair care data interoperability in the polar space. I will be going into two of them specifically, so that'd be Polder and CCADI briefly in a minute, and just kind of highlighting the different initiatives and how they've approached enhancing interoperability in the Arctic and Antarctic spaces in the past couple of years. But of course, thank you, Cindy, for taking the time to really orient us with the fair and the care too. The one other principle or framework that I wanted to highlight too is the trust principles. So that's more related to the repository specifically, and ensuring that the repository is transparent, is being responsible, user-focused, and sustainability and technology with their practices. So specifically looking at how semantic markup is a core technology we have at our disposal to ensure the data managers adhere to these principles, and repositories as well. It is quite the landscape to try and navigate, and they all kind of go hand in hand and work in tandem together, the fair, care, and trust. So again, trying to orient ourselves in this discussion moving forward, I find this diagram, although simple, it is helpful to kind of talk about what level interoperability are we looking at. So there's 3 levels that I personally find it helpful to highlight: is the metadata interoperability, then you kind of have the data set level interoperability, and then the algorithm interoperability. All of these do feed into the FAIR principles, and the FAIR principles address kind of the different aspects or characteristics of these different categories in different ways. But within these 3 categories, you have the syntactic, semantic, and schematic considerations that go into aiding interoperability at each level. So first, I believe that I will be talking briefly about CCADI, and they really did do a fantastic job at addressing all 3 levels. But later on, the Polder community really is looking at just that metadata level. So I wanted to make that clear, those distinctions, before we jump right into it. So wanted to highlight the work of CCADI. So founded in 2015, the Canadian Consortium for Arctic Data Interoperability, aka CCADI, was an initiative to develop an integrated Canadian Arctic data management system that facilitates discovery, sharing standards, and enables interoperability among existing data infrastructures. So the goal was to not reinvent the wheel. It was to build on existing standards and initiatives, and kind of provide some use cases or proof of concepts. You can see the little wheel on the right hand that labels or identifies all the various organizations that participated in this project. And of course, Shannon is our true fearless leader that has really been spearheading CCADI since the start. And I really wanted to just highlight that if you have any questions, comments, concerns, she will be the one. We're lucky to have her in the room today to help talk more about, you know, how CCADI came to be and whatnot. But over the CCADI term, we really focused on 3 use cases. So they chose 3 kind of thin slice approaches to look at applying interoperable, you know, standards and initiatives at these various levels. And throughout this, they produced some products. So there's a CCADI metadata API that amalgamates, I believe it's 9 organizations within CCADI, their metadata, and then feeds it up into the broader polar data search that I'll go into shortly. There's also the federated metadata catalog, semantic mediator, data service endpoints, and then platform service endpoints. All of this has been provided through the documentation products, or as we call them, cookbooks, and it kind of gives you that line by line algorithm and probability that you would be able to reproduce or repurpose the work that's been done in the CCADI space for your own purposes. So everything's open source, supposed to be reproducible. And so the ones I wanted to quickly highlight is the ocean acidification. That was use case 3, really worth like providing a proof of concept for oceanographic buoy data and having interoperability at that data set level. So through the cookbooks, you know, we're having more interoperability through algorithms and providing that and making that accessible. And then they do have the proof of concept at the data set level of interoperability and merging, I think it's 3 different organizations, oceanographic buoy data into a single source and producing, you know, a larger, more robust data set that way. And then they do have the metadata interoperability at the same time with their aggregator and API. So in their aggregating API was really created in tandem and used the same technology that we use in the international space through PolDAR. So PolDAR is the Polar Data Discovery Enhancement Research. The little QR code up on the right-hand corner should bring you to the About page if you want to learn more. But PolDAR really came to fruition through the collaboration of the ADC, the Southern Ocean Observing System, and the Standing Committee of Antarctic Data Management. And they were looking at how we can you know, really improve upon the current data systems. And through that, they identified the federated search platform. So their objectives for the group is to explore federated search and is it achievable, how would you do it and whatnot. They picked federated searches that allows users to search multiple metadata catalogs simultaneously while avoiding many of the technical challenges associated with duplicating and translating metadata records. The challenges also include mismatches between vocabularies that's different of repository use and difficulty in keeping translated metadata records up to date and whatnot. They did really find that, you know, when you have, I think we're up to 40 different metadata standards that are out there. We have different repositories and data centers using various ones. It was pretty much impossible to try and get everybody to agree on a single metadata standard. So the federated search pathways really allowed for us to allow repositories to kind of have that autonomy and make that decision for themselves, but still participate in the larger, you know, interoperable frameworks used through the federated search system. So this is really done through using the use of semantic technologies. And then, you know, by identifying things such as schema.org, which I do believe I have a couple slides to kind of go into a little bit deeper of what that is, we were able to create the polar data search. So the polar data search, the link up in the QR code, so I should bring you right to the polar data search, but it's a single search interface which allows researchers, stakeholders, and rights holders to search metadata from various participating repositories in one spot. So as you saw that really ridiculous, messy map of mapping the polar data ecosystem, so instead of going to 180 different repositories to try and find your data that you need, you could go to the one single search interface instead and save a lot of time for, you know, stakeholders, researchers, policymakers, people alike. We really wanted to try and make the polar data search a tailored user experience. So everything was grassroots, bottom-up approach. The PolDAR community told us what they wanted with, you know, different faceted options and search options and whatnot. And then we're able to kind of just any changes and things moving forward were done through that. So we are still continuing to maintain the polar data search and actually currently looking at different back-end options for, you know, our graph databases and whatnot. And actually ANA, Arctic Institute North America, that Shannon runs, is a fantastic reporter, and CCADI does provide the technical support for the polar data search through ANA as well. So currently, right now, the polar data search has 25 different participating repositories. The unique thing about the polar data search in particular is that it's an aggregator and indexer that indexes others. So the Arctic Data Center and Data One, they have similar technologies and infrastructure in place. And so if a repository, say, has already kind of gone through and been integrated or indexed by Data One, you don't have to do the semantic markup through the polar data search or through our best practices. We can kind of just index you indirectly that way. So it does help for, trying to alleviate the burden on repositories, as you know, that in the Arctic and Antarctic space, we're a small but mighty community, not a ton of resources or capacity to spend a lot of time on these things. So we've really tried to think of innovative solutions to make things interoperable and easier for repositories to participate that way. So as I mentioned, it was really through the use of the semantic technologies. And so Holder had seen the work that was done with ESIP, and I know some of you did attend the ESIP meetings last week, but specifically through the Science on Schema cluster, who built guidelines for the Earth science community on how to implement schema.org for the dataset level of metadata. So it's a shared vocabulary that makes it easier for webmasters and developers to decide on schema, and again, helps with that interoperability at the metadata level. It enhances discoverability without conforming to certain metadata standards, like I've mentioned. In worst case scenario, say a repository completes the schema.org markup, the polar federated search, polar data search is no longer a thing. It is still actually being used and can be picked up and integrated and indexed into the Google dataset search, which it's kind of not a worst case scenario, but better than nothing, right? I did want to quickly highlight too, before moving on to the next steps, is just that with the implementation of the schema.org best practices, we have very new members who had no clue what schema.org is, not really familiar with technologies, implement them for the repository. And it took them about a week's worth of time, like a full 40-hour work week. And then we've had other repositories who, were a little bit more familiar, implemented it with it in a day. So it is supposed to be this lightweight, adaptable vocabulary that you can really do without that capacity that sometimes is lacking in our community. And that's kind of what drove the momentum forward. But next steps for the Polar community is to really work on knowledge mobilization, looking forward to how can we support the International Polar Year and interoperability initiatives through them. As I mentioned, we're helping to update data policies and principles. And then we also want to, really focusing on that Indigenous data sovereignty support through things like incorporating local context through traditional knowledge and biocultural labels, and including guidance on how to do that. How to, include that in your markup, your semantic technologies to make sure that that information is displayed and indexed properly. So that's going to be coming up. We have had some great conversations, local context, so their schema.org profile is in the works, but not quite there yet. So just kind of keep an eye out. And then I did want to quickly highlight that a lot of this work gets done through our meetings in the polar space. So IPART 4, which is going to be in Colorado in March 2025, is going to be a fantastic space for this too. And then even a lot of this work has stemmed from the Polar Data Forum. Our next one will be October 2025 in Hobart, Australia. Fantastic location if any of you are interested. It will coincide either before or after. The dates are not totally nailed down yet, but before or after IDW, which is in Brisbane. So you're already down at the end of that world, and kind of come hop over to the Polar Data Forum and see what's happening on that space. So as I wanted to quickly highlight, Polar Data Forums in the past, we did just have one. In these spaces, we highlighted, vessel workshops. So globally, we had a lot of different initiatives from the ice representatives from icebreakers to kind of come and talk about the pros and cons of data management, what they've been doing on the ships, off the ships, how to get data in real time versus after the fact, and you know, how to improve these large scale data exchanges. We also had a conference portion and hackathons. Shannon did run some POWIG hackathons too, so we do kind of try to cover all the updates that happened through those 10 different working groups that I highlighted near the beginning of the presentation, and really kind of get the community updated and see what the latest developments are. So just highlighting again the session themes, as you can see, of course, fair data for polar regions, tools like technology, knowledge mobilization, and whatnot. And then, yes, sorry, got ahead of myself. Next host our Australian Antarctic Data Center in Hobart. Be there. It's going to be super fun. And with that, I think I'm hopefully close to time. But if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to reach out at any time, and I'd be happy to expand upon any of this work. And I know that was very high level overview of it all, but happy to dive deeper if anybody's interested.
Thanks so much, Chantelle. Before we transition to the next speaker, and maybe we'll put questions and comments and things in the chat for now, and then we can hold till the end for the rest of it. We did have one person join on the phone from an 805 number. I did go ahead and mute you because we were having a little audio feedback, but I just want to make sure that you know that you can use *6 to mute and unmute. And if you are able to and interested, you're welcome to come off mute now and introduce yourself. Again, that's *6 to mute or unmute.
Hi, thank you for unmuting me. I'm Angie Garcia. I'm one of the community engagement outreach coordinators for the Arctic Data Center, and I was just hopping in on the call to listen, but thank you for muting me at the beginning. I appreciate that.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for joining. And if you happen to also be at a computer, I can make sure that you have access to the slides and things so you can be on your phone and the computer. And if not, we'll just let you listen in. And Shannon, if you go through, if there are points where you can help orient what's going on the slides, that's great to remember as well. With that, Laura and Cindy, are we good to pass it over to Shannon?
Yeah, I think, yeah. Unless there are any burning questions from the group for Chantelle. Okay. All right, yeah, Shannon, please go right ahead. Thanks.
Okay. Sorry, this is being a little annoying. Why is it? Sorry.
I think it's in the slideshow. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry about that.
All
All right. Okay, so as noted by several people, I'm Shannon McAllister. I work at the Arctic Institute of North America at the University of Calgary. We are located in Calgary, Alberta, the traditional territories of Treaty 7 peoples. That's the Siksika, the Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda nations, as well as the Métis people of Alberta, districts 5 and 6. And happy to acknowledge the land that we're all on today, or at least I am, and we're on. It's virtual. It's one of those things. Okay, so like most of the people here, I wear several different hats, and today's hat I am representing the Polar Observing Assets Working Group. I am one of the co-chairs with Bill Manley. So today I'm going to be giving a brief overview of a new resource for information sharing, which is the Registry of Polar Observing Networks, or RoPON as it's called. And this tool is designed to help showcase and integrate the summed contributions of multiple systems across the high latitudes. So I'm sorry, I'm going to be reading a little bit from Bill's notes. This was originally his presentation. But broadly speaking, there is a recognized need for an Arctic an integrated Arctic observing system with a means of identifying strengths and gaps, a knowledge map to clarify directions, and ways to build capacity to better meet observing goals. So the challenge here is obtaining a comprehensive perspective across a highly fragmented and distributed landscape of observing efforts. Many dozens, and more likely hundreds, of agencies, organizations, projects, and programs observe climate and environmental phenomena at high latitudes, each with its own geographic extent, thematic scope, governance, or funding. Because of this, it is currently difficult for science planners to assess status, overlap, and gaps, for network managers to optimize limited resources, for funding officers to avoid duplicated effort, for individual researchers to collaborate with facilities or projects, and for community members to discover, engage with, and leverage observational efforts and data collected nearby. But the real challenge is actually a lack of interoperability with this information across networks. Many have or share details through custom metadata structures and vocabularies. So they're reinventing the wheel each time, resulting in apples and oranges that are difficult to pull together and harmonize. And Chantelle mentioned this in her talk previously with the work on Polder. Most do not share the information through machine-readable access. For example, many simply present the information as a table on a web page or in a PDF. And finally, there is much duplicated effort with building asset catalogs from scratch. So this lack of interoperability leads to a mismatch across different implementations. Some fields carry across without any problems. Some are not quite the same, but feasible for harmonization, and others are fairly problematic. And some have gaps on either side, requiring laborious backfilling when aggregating metadata records for a broader perspective. In other words, it can be really difficult to carry across fields, especially when you're working between different disciplines. So it's true that many observing networks and related organizations have built and shared catalogs of their observing assets for their own internal purposes, and these are examples of some of them. And as we know, there need not and should not be only one single portal necessarily, but almost all of these ones listed here are defined by geographic or thematic scope or by governance and funding, and they're most commonly used for individual networks. And there are many networks that have not shared catalogs of their observing or monitoring capacities. So this is where RoPON comes in. So to address this, the Registry of Polar Observing Networks was released in October of last year. It's a catalog of systems or organizations that conduct or coordinate observation and monitoring at high latitudes, typically with data management, research stations, platforms, and instrumentation. Some examples of this are CEOS, GTN-P, Interact, and NASA Above. Some of those I don't even know what the acronyms are for, sorry about that. It also displays discovery portals that are not observing networks per se, but which compile and share structured information about observing activities and infrastructure. For example, RMAP, AOV, ISAFIC, and PolArctic. RoPON was created as a collaborative effort by the Arctic Portal, the University of Colorado INSTAR, and the SAON Polar Observing Assets Working Group, or POAG. And you can visit RoPON at polarobservingregistry.org, as you can see on the screen. I wish we had time for a demo today, but we're going to be going through it too quickly. So at the homepage, users can browse, search, or filter for summary cards, one for each network. Clicking on a card leads to a network landing page showing discovery level details encompassing network description, observational scope, spatial extent, data or metadata access, and links to more information. Sorry, I've got some stuff stuck together here. There we go. So what is in RoPON? Essentially, it's observing networks and discovery portals. And for those that maybe can't see the screen, observing networks are systems or organizations that coordinate or conduct observation and monitoring of climate or environmental phenomena, typically with data management and infrastructure such as research stations, platforms, or information. This is all the stuff that I read previously, so I don't know why it's in here again. Sorry about that. So we're just going to move past what's in RoPON. And then observing assets. So these are discrete individual components of in situ infrastructure. Research and monitoring sites such as stations, facilities, vegetation plots, moorings, super sites, etc., and mobile platforms such as buoys, ships, and more, as well as related activities, scientific research projects, field-based campaigns, and scientific cruises, and the overarching programs, networks, and observing systems themselves. For the architecture, the technology architecture for RoPON uses open source solutions with a relational database, backend framework, web app frontend, and web server, all virtualized for reproducible deployment and development. Also released was a network-level metadata model listing the elements that describe polar observing networks with definitions, examples, and controlled vocabularies. And this underlies the RoPON database and may be of interest to others that wish to track details about observing networks. So one of the things that isn't listed in my notes here is that RoPON is currently at prototype level. There are only 20 on here out of hundreds. Funding for RoPON from NOAA will begin this fall, and that's going to allow us to move RoPON beyond a prototype with improvements in scope, functionality, and interoperability. There will be refinements for front-end and user experience, an upgraded backend to enable essential features, and development of schema.org compatible JSON LD profile for observing networks, as well as community engagement, web usability testing, and metadata curation. We're currently working on the schema.org with the polar data search and a little bit with ESIP. And then these are the source catalogs for harvesting of site level metadata into the Polar Observing Site Discoveries tool. So you can see that there's source catalogs from AOV, Oscar Surface, Deems SDR, CEOS, Interact, and others. So RoPON and the network level metadata model are part of a broader collaboration through the Polar Observing Assets Working Group to make observing related metadata more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, the FAIR principles as we know. POAG is a bridge between the polar observing and polar data communities, ultimately making it easier for organizations to populate, deploy, and share catalogs of observing assets. If you are interested in joining us, you can sign up at polarobservingassets.org to join our monthly meetings or just to stay informed. Some of our tasks include creating a registry of polar observing networks focusing on interoperability parameters if they have a metadata catalog of assets, so that is RoPON. Building tools to facilitate harmonization across implementations, and creating a guide to make it easier for networks to populate, deploy, and share a catalog of observing assets. And we're also working towards recommendations for organizations that wish to track observing assets, and we are beginning to assess relevant metadata standards and schema.org markup profiles for various types of observing assets. With slow but steady progress and participation by many individuals from both the observing and data communities, we anticipate that some of the outcomes from our group will be providing a basis for planning and integration across multiple systems, helping to make observing related information more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and making it easier for individual networks or organizations to build, share, and deploy catalogs of observing assets. Recommendations. These are with regard to ICART priorities and more generally. We encourage the sharing of observing related metadata. We suggest not reinventing the wheel for observing related metadata and using established standards and vocabularies when possible. And finally, taking advantage of existing portals that are already used for observing related information. Lots of ones listed here: PolarDex, Interact, CEOS, etc. So thank you for that. I've gone through things pretty quickly. I want to end my slideshow if I can. There we go. And just in the chat, I'm just gonna bring this in. If you are interested in suggesting a network to RoPON, we do have a Google form where people can suggest things. Do you want me to start answering questions right away, or I don't know, there's stuff in the chat.
I wanted to jump in here and say thank you so much for Chantelle and Shannon for those fantastic presentations. And I definitely want to be able to open it up for questions at this point. And so start thinking about what questions are going to be asked. I'm going to share our crowdsourcing document. That is now the last thing in the chat so everybody can see it. Okay, so we're interested in not just our two experts that gave fantastic talks, but we know that our crowd always has a lot of fantastic information as well. And so it's one of the themes we've been doing as part of the data management team, asking for more feedback. And so I just wanted to say that this document has a set of questions at the top. And if you feel like you have an interesting note that you want to put in there, just you can write your idea on one of the bullet points. Actually, maybe I can share my screen. That works. Does that work? People saying it?
Yeah, if you could zoom in a bit.
So just to go over the structure, I think we've got a set of questions. And then interoperability resources. And so this is actually more even populated than I saw it a few minutes ago. But it's basically just, a title, a little blurb about what it is, a link to it, and then tags where there's some information on what you're thinking for how it's related to the world in which we live. And there's a start set here. So if anybody else has more features, these are one of those really great tools for the data management team to be able to share at the end of some of our quarterly reports and being able to say, here's utilities that IARPIC is able to bring out by coordinating some of these larger meetings. So I would like to open the floor to any questions, general questions that anybody has. For our speakers. I think I saw some hands up at some point.
I think I see Matt Jones has a question in the chat. And Matt, feel free to unmute if you'd like to ask your question to Shannon.
Thanks, Cindy. Shannon already answered it, that she's going to look into the GitHub repository for that, so that's great. But I will take this opportunity to put out a plug that if folks are interested in that vocabulary mapping for basically trying to create an interoperable vocabulary between what RoPON is doing and how the schema.org world works, then the ESIP SOSO cluster is starting that activity, and there's an open opportunity to help contribute to that mapping, which is underway now through the ESIP SOSO cluster.
And I know both Chantelle and I would second that. Chantelle's pretty active in the ESIP SOSO cluster. I have not yet joined in, well, I'm there sporadically, but there's also the Semantics and Vocabularies Working Group of the Arctic Data Committee, which is part of ESIP, working with ESIP as well.
So I think my first question that I would actually really like to ask is that it always feels like, I mean, everyone says semantics. And so I want to ask the semantics question of, what do you mean by semantics? And also there's other vocabulary that if you aren't really invested in this, you haven't heard the word ontology in a particular context. And so I'm wondering if you guys have some of these, what is semantics mean? What is just interoperability in terms of fair and fair, and just sort of defining some of that space, especially for some of the new to this space units.
Okay, so Chantelle, how do you feel if I start and you pick up?
That's good.
Yeah,
Okay.
and Shannon, could you just restate the question as you understood it? I feel like Lauren, your audio was a little fuzzy at times, and I feel like I got most of it, but if you could just restate what you understood from it and then answer the question, that would be awesome.
The bare bones is essentially what is semantics when we talk about it, and what do we mean when we're talking about it in this computer data world. And I really like that question because I didn't know what semantics meant not very long ago, and had a lot of trouble, even when I joined the Semantics and Vocabularies Working Group. I had a very different idea of what I thought semantics was as an English major versus what they mean by semantics in this particular realm. So I feel like I've been where you are, Lauren, and I don't really get it either. So I'm going to try and give a really basic explanation of semantics here. And Chantelle can maybe correct me. We don't have Rebecca Ingram here, unfortunately, who is our semantics guru. But how I see semantics in this context is that semantics is the medium in which you take two different things and you're kind of trying to figure out a way for them to talk to each other. So if you have, and actually somebody in the chat just said lexicon, it is a little bit like a Rosetta Stone kind of thing, where you are crosswalking information from one field to another field. So over here, you have documents written in Fahrenheit. You have temperatures in Fahrenheit. And somebody else has done all their studies and everything is in Celsius. And you need to find a way to make those understand each other. So a semantic operators will help you figure out, it's that formula that helps you figure out what does this mean and what does that mean. And the different ontologies will help you do that too. And it can be really tricky in many ways when you're working in the Arctic, because the Arctic is defined geographically, and most information, at least from what I can see, is defined by discipline. So when you have something that's multidisciplinary, and for example, in the Canadian Consortium for Arctic Data Interoperability, all of the documents in my database is a weird database in that it's more like a library catalog. I have a lot of documents, I have a lot of books, I have a lot of journal articles, and how do I show somebody that's looking for weather data, that I have a lot of articles on weather data, with someone who, and also talking to a database about sensor data coming in from an app, and trying to make a search figure out that both of those are the same thing and which fields align and which fields do not. So maybe it's not so basic. Chantelle, how am I doing? I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, I think that was great. And I will admit that, yeah, when I first joined this community and everybody's made this community, I'm like, what are you, like, what is that? So, I mean, the one diagram, and I did try to find a version of it real quick, so I'll share the screen. This is one that really helped me, and I've seen kind of different versions of it over the years that helped me kind of get my head around it, like the semantic framework. So it's kind of the ontologies, the conceptual models, taxonomies, thesaurus, controlled vocabularies. That entire framework is semantics. I'll drop the link to that kind of diagram in the chat from the paper, but the use, or the practical use of it that I think is, like, you know, there's so many different controlled vocabularies, ways to describe things out there, like Shannon was saying. And it's, yeah, just kind of how do these things relate to each other, or like actually applied in the setting. So I know that we did the Polar Semantics and Vocabularies Working Group did kind of try to pool resources from the Polar community on, like, what vocabularies are being used in the around, like, at the different levels. So there is a spreadsheet that I think there was about 48 different resources, and kind of outlined what they were each being used for on that kind of spectrum of the entire framework. So that's just helped kind of dive deeper. It is a kind of difficult topic to try and explain. So I think you did a great job, Shannon. Those are just the resources I would add to help support what you said. Yeah.
Well,
So
Matt,
happy for
Matt
everybody.
Matt also put a great link in the comments, and I have the feeling that he might want to say something here. No?
No, but I will say that graph that Chantelle showed is the same one I was referring to from the McGinnis paper. So that's actually
Yep.
the same thing. It came from Deborah McGinnis, who was the author, one of the co-authors of the OWL standard, and she wrote up a paper in the late 90s kind of talking about this issue. So it's been around for decades, this issue of how precise do you get when you're trying to specify stuff for interoperability. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, the level of granularity is pretty important, because with some stuff you can't get that fine, or you're just not going to be able to do the search. As an aside, and this is somewhat related, when I first got into this area, I also had a lot of trouble understanding what an API was, because I'm not a computer scientist, I am a librarian. And people kept talking to me about APIs when I got into starting to work with data. And so I found this really great description of an API that I'll share for anybody else that needs basic level information. And that is, if you have one database and another database and an API that needs to do the work between them, consider that one database is a menu and the other database is the kitchen, and the API is the waiter that's going between the menu and the kitchen, explaining what's going on from one to the other. I found that really helpful.
That's a pretty fun aside. I like it. So a picture was worth 1,000 words on that one too. It's that semantic spectrum, which makes me actually think about Chantelle's plot that she heard talking about the semantic technologies, and wondering on what range does that, how does it work, and like on what range of those in that great plot.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm happy to be called out if Matt is our guru for the technical side. But my understanding is that we kind of operate in the controlled vocabulary ontology and a bit of taxonomy in there too, level. Like it's kind of somewhere in the middle. Like we're not super granular, not super, down on the bottom of that ladder. But yeah, it's a little bit more on the broader side, if anything. If that answers your question. And sorry, Matt, I see
so
you.
like I was just going to give an example to make it a little more concrete. Like, so in the process of doing this RoPON work, the POA working group developed a vocabulary for describing observing assets, which they basically articulated in an Excel spreadsheet with definitions for each of the terms. And that's a simple controlled vocabulary. It's not particularly standardized because it's, relatively small number of people use it at that point. And what we're going through right now is an attempt to try to map that controlled vocabulary onto sort of a more formalized ontology, the schema.org ontology. So that is basically trying to take the terms from the controlled vocabulary at schema.org, try to find out where there are corresponding terms that exactly match that in schema.org. When possible, use those terms. And when it's not possible, possibly make up new terms or create hybrids between other existing vocabularies. So that process is basically trying to relate a local information resource that's used by a small community to a broader information resource that's used by, say, in this case, the global web search giants like Google and Bing and groups like that. So.
And just to add to what Matt said, that's what the ESIP group with Science on SOSO is kind of, did I say that right? Is kind of working on, is when there are terms that don't show up in schema but need to be applied at a broad level. And for observing assets, there are some where there isn't a precise term or anything that's kind of close enough. Is that group is working to include or add some of those terms to schema.
Yeah, so I think on that kind of note, thinking about controlled vocabulary, I'm going to go for, just wrapping this up, making sure that I can get in my announcement that the next meeting is utilizing societal context to promote responsible data collection, management, and research applications. And so that's a long title. the pitch for the data management next talk is that the world is a messy place, and making things interoperable can remove some of that messiness because it's controlled vocabulary, right? But that can hide a lot of bias and maybe hidden bias, and that can then, you know, exacerbate some of those hidden biases in models that we've done. So how do you go from the messy worlds to building functional models that don't perpetuate that bias? So we're going to be having Donald Martin from give a talk on a possible solution to that called community-based system dynamics. And so that discussion will be October 10th, and I hope everyone will come and join for that. This meeting has been recorded, and so you'll be able to check that out, the IARPIC website. I would like to once again thank Shannon and Chantelle for the speakers for giving great talks today. And thank you for joining our IARPIC data management team meeting. Is there anything else that we want to say, Hazel, or any other last minute questions now that it's on the hour?
I just want to express our gratitude again to our speakers, Shannon and Chantelle. Thanks for sharing your time, and everyone in the call. Thank you for sharing your time today, and for the active engagement. And for the crowdsourcing document, that doesn't stop after our meeting. Please feel free to share any resources or thoughts or insights that you have on that. But yeah, I just want to for us to give another round of virtual applause to our speakers, Shannon and Chantelle. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I just want to add one last thing, and that is I would love to attend these meetings. If I could be added to a mailing list, that would be great. Thank you.
Yep, I'll follow up with you about that. And if anyone else wants to know how to join the IARPIC website or anything like that, I'll throw my email in the chat and feel free to reach out.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks again, all. Have a good one.
Thanks.